Welcome back, everyone. We just wrapped up a panel on federal representative activities in the space of mobility. We'll move on to the next panel on infrastructure and opportunities improving mobility for all. The moderator will be Carol Wright, Director of Easterseals Transportation Group and co-director of the National Aging and Disability Transportation Group, an FDA-funded technical assistance center. Previously, Carol served as National Director of the Easterseals Project Action Entity and co-director of the National Center on Senior Transportation. Carol was also Associate Director of the Small Urban and Rural Transit Center, Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at NDSU, Executive Director of Senior Services and Public Transportation for a multi-county agency in Central North Dakota, Director of a residential facility for traumatic brain injuries, held management positions in long-term care, and was an independent consultant in marketing and development. Carol, take it away and introduce the panelists.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel on improving mobility for all, infrastructure and opportunities. This summit is critical, and this topic is particularly key as we examine the road ahead and we begin to reimagine mobility. We have three great speakers lined up for you today. Each of them brings a real unique perspective to improving mobility, and collectively they bring insights that will help set the stage for our later small group discussions that we'll have this afternoon. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes and we'll take questions at the end of the entire panel's presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and I'll be monitoring those and I'll collect those. And after all the speakers are done presenting, I'll be glad to ask them your questions and direct them to the appropriate presenter once the panel has concluded. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Sheryl Gross-Glaser. Sheryl Gross-Glaser is the president of SGG Consulting LLC, and she's the former director of the Community Transportation Association of America's National Center for Applied Transit Technology. As part of her continuing work, Sheryl is a writer focusing on the accessibility and equity issues involved in automated vehicles, transit, and shared use vehicles. At CTAA, Sheryl was the founder of the National Technical Assistance Center, N-CATT, which supports statewide, small urban and rural adoption of emerging technologies and transportation services. She also founded the Partnership for Mobility Management, a national network of over 2,000 transportation professionals. Previously, Sheryl was an appellate attorney and an editor for criminal defense publications. She won significant victories in state and federal appellate courts and authored studies on DNA evidence, eyewitness identifications, and many forensic and procedural topics. We are delighted to welcome Sheryl to our panel this afternoon. Hi, Sheryl.
Hi, Carol. It's so nice to be here. Nice to see you. And thank you for inviting me to present. I see that my little emoji didn't get there in the title, but didn't translate. But I'll give you the answer. It's a spoiler alert in case anybody has to step away, which is that a lot of hard work and major changes are going to have to take place in order for the AV revolution to be equitable and or accessible. Next slide, please. I won't go into my background after the introduction, except to say that my years in the criminal justice world, it really was like a graduate level course in what the results of a lack of equity mean. And transportation has a big place in rectifying those kind of equitable equity problems. Next slide. So if you look at the outline, the word technology and AVs are not in there. That's because I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that surround and are different from the science that goes into them, the engineering that goes into them, in order to make sure that what we get when the AV revolution happens will be accessible and equitable. And I'm going to look through the prism of a lesson from COVID-19, then look into what we have now, and then into how we can perhaps work together to create a better reality when we have our transportation revolution. Next slide, please. So the scientists there who are in our audience, the engineers, you can turn off your videos now because you will be cringing in a moment when you hear what I have to say, which is that you throw millions of dollars and lots of great brains at a big problem, and they create these folks create miracles. I mean, look at the vaccines that we have in such a short amount of time. It's incredible, right? But we've had a worldwide experiment in a mixture of culture, location, and wealth, and what that means for how many people have gotten sick and died, and which of us in which countries we live in have had a relatively normal life during the pandemic, and which of us have not. If you compare the United States with Hong Kong, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, where they really shut down the pandemic, it's a very different experience than what we've had here, and very different than what we're seeing now in Brazil, for example. So even though the scientific facts of how we've handled the vaccine, the science is the same, how cultures and populations have dealt with it are very different. And despite those facts, it's very difficult to steer a society toward change. Next slide. So this is how I see our transportation system. I don't look at it in terms of, do you have a car or not? Do you have access to transit or not, or a bike? But what is your situation in terms of, do you have transportation that's available, and do you have an option if that transportation falls through, whether that your car doesn't work, or your train line isn't running that day, or your bus isn't coming? Do you have another option? And that doesn't necessarily depend on whether you have a car or not. I mean, obviously the reality, whether you live in the middle of Manhattan or DC, is very different than if you live in an exurb or in a rural area. And then you have the experience of people with disabilities, which no matter where you live is problematic because most vehicles are not accessible. So someone can't easily carpool if they are in a wheelchair, for example. And the ADA, which certainly made some good changes in terms of transportation, was a first step, but obviously not a complete solution. Next slide, please. This is from a study that was done very recently, dealing with Allegheny County, Pittsburgh. So if you look at this, it's just an example. You can look after report that discusses this kind of topic the same way, and basically uses vehicle possession or ownership as an indicator, right? And the only reason that it's a decent indicator in most places in the United States is that most places are designed primarily for motor vehicle transportation, not for bikes or people to walk or people to use transit. And it's an excellent report, by the way, if anybody wants to read it. Next slide, please. And these are the different modes we have. That combination at the top is really that secret sauce in most communities of how people get around. That combination of parking and privately owned vehicles. And if you think about it, the brilliance of the auto manufacturing community has been creating and enabling a network that has perpetuated its own interests. You don't need anybody from GM or Ford Motor Company at a planning meeting or a county commission meeting, right? Because we've created this network that we all assume to operate in a certain way. And the prism is through that auto-oriented transportation. Next slide. That means we look at things like speed as normal, the way we design and measure roadway efficiency, the punishments for violent behavior. I think the Tiger Woods case is really just a great example. He was going 40 miles above the speed limit. He was creating what was the equivalent of reckless endangerment, of shooting into a crowd, right? He was lucky that nobody was actually on that road, so no one else got injured or killed. But he created a very dangerous situation, and yet he's not being charged. Somehow just the fact that he got these terrible injuries is enough, but we're not considering this like that he created a violent situation. And that's how much that auto-oriented perspective permeates our culture. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into detail because I only have 10 minutes. You could talk a long time about this, but this is the way we divide the responsibilities in terms, or regulation in terms of vehicles. Next slide. And then there's a bunch of federal agencies that have something to do with it. I didn't mention DOE, but there are lots of other agencies. If you look at FCC, the communications technology related to connected vehicles, they're involved with. Next slide. And then you have various levels of government. You have state and federal and local. And the photo of the ship in the Seuss Canal, just to show that, you know, the different players are comfortable at different levels of government. And that's something that's very big to change. This is why, I'll just give 2 examples. This is why there's lots of talk that the automobile companies, manufacturers may be buying up insurance companies in the future, because the insurance companies operate state to state. Insurance is regulated state to state and not on the federal level. And so instead of creating their own expertise in every state, they might be merging or partnering with insurance companies when we have AVs. Another example is Uber. Uber essentially created a national car service system. But the brilliant part of what they did, because that kind of system operated locally in some different places. I certainly grew up with that in Brooklyn. You could call a car, 5 minutes later, it would be there. But what they did was they decided not to play in that local city sandbox where the taxi companies were very comfortable and had a lot of authority. They went to the state level and got state laws passed that preempted a lot of what was going on at the municipal level and enabled the Uber and other companies to thrive. Next slide. So we have what's essentially a very irrational system. You can read about, you know, the ratification debates for the US Constitution, you know, so going far back, this irrationality, you know, is rooted in American history. But what you do get is something that Justice Brandeis called laboratory of democracy, each state being a different laboratory and experimenting with different ways to regulate and deal with different issues. Next slide. So in terms of AVs, there's various types of state laws that exist, some just saying, let's have a study, some saying, here, we're open for business. I won't go into detail, but if you want 2 good sources, one would be the National Conference of State Legislatures, has a really good database on legislation that's pending, and also state laws and executive orders that have been passed. And then there was, about 10 days ago, Government Technology had a nice article that really sums up what's going on at the state level. Any federal law will definitely preempt state laws. But 2 things I think we really should be looking at is whether NHTSA will have sufficient funding and staff expertise and the money to pay that staff well to adequately regulate and enforce regulations, because that's as important as actually having regulations. And then there's been no talk that I've heard of actually expanding the ADA now, or specifically for AVs, or saying we have 10 years till every vehicle is accessible, nothing like that. And I think that's a very big concern in terms of broadening accessibility. Next slide. And then obviously there's tons more details if you're going into talking about state laws and possibilities for federal laws. So there's lots going on across the country. These are just some examples. Internationally, lots of stuff going on, lots of testing and pilots. I'll just mention a few countries: England, Japan, Singapore, China, Israel, Korea, Switzerland, Australia, India, Russia, Finland. I even read about some research going on in Vietnam very recently. This is big time, tons of money being thrown at these issues. These are shared use examples that I have, and transit or transit-like examples. In Minnesota, they're going to be doing pilot relating to a rural corridor, which is very nice. And some of these are really designed to be a transit experience, as opposed to just let's get somebody onto an automated vehicle and have them experience that, not really as a transportation tool. Okay, next slide. So, boy, things really got changed. Anyway, so Peter Norton is a historian of engineering and society at UVA, and I think what he has to say is very relevant here, that if we're going to have greater access and accessibility, we really have to look at the details. It's not going to happen magically. Next slide. Dr. Seuss has a nice quote. Margaret Mead has one that's similar. If we're going to have improvements in this realm, we have to have people who are really pushing that and are concentrating on that. If you look at things like women's suffrage and equality, civil rights, health insurance, there's lots of topics you could point to. Some took decades of work before there were improvements, and some we haven't seen improvements on. So it's these things, any kind of improvement is not going to happen magically. Our transportation system is not going to, in an instant, change when we have AVs to be more equitable and more accessible. Next slide. But we do have one sector that's spending a lot of money, not only on the technology, but on making sure that the transportation serves its own needs and its own desire for profits, and that's the auto and tech community. So, and they have various policy and other ways of ensuring that the system they've created will perpetuate. Yet, I don't know about all of you, but when I mention to folks that I'm in transportation, they immediately start talking about what they'd like and how it would be great to have AVs and all of that. But they're very busy, so they're not investing their resources and spending their time contacting their legislatures or being on the US Access Board online dialogue, right? They have their wishes, but they're not spending that time. And we have to know that there is a sector that is spending that time. And unless we push them or push government in the right direction, we're not necessarily going to have a change from what we have now. And that's what worries me. But next slide. We do have some sleeping giants. This headline is from right after the election, noting that people with disabilities voted in record numbers, which is very encouraging. And if we look at the disability community, 1 in 4 women have a disability, 1 in 4 African Americans have a disability, about 14% of the general population self-identifies as having a disability, but they have dire needs right now. So they're not concentrating on AVs. There are some good people in the disability community who are working on this, but not solely on this issue. And I would say likewise of the transit community, the biking community, walking advocates, those in the safety community, aging, equity and urban planning, they all have an interest in this, but the resources that perhaps the auto and tech companies have are not necessarily there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next, please.
And Sheryl, you have about 1 minute left.
So I'll go very, very quickly. Okay, so why don't we skip the next slide, go to the one after that. We have a really good example from the biking community because they have a simple, cohesive message. They're very on point. They join coalitions when it's relevant. They send in lots of comments when there's opportunities at the federal level, and they also play well when it comes to communicating with our elected leaders. Next slide. And there's lots of opportunities here. And if you look at, I've just mentioned a few different ways for thinking about this or models of how we can move forward. But it's really reconceiving of transportation as a public good instead of a private profit-making good. You know, what are different ways that we can make it more equitable and think of transportation as a tool for access instead of something we each conceive of individually. And I can end there since I'm at my time.
Thank you so much, Sheryl, for that. We are going to ask people if you have comments or questions to be able to put them into the chat. If we have time, we will definitely be able to take some of those before we go into the breakout sessions. And I am going to ask that our next presenter, Ken McLeod, who is also a member of our advisory board for Mobility 21 and Traffic 21, to begin his presentation. Ken?
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me get it going here. I'll share it. So I'm Ken McLeod. I'm the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. You can find me on Twitter at KenMCLD. And really, the League of American Bicyclists is all about promoting bicycling. We believe bicycling brings people together, and we want to lead the movement to create a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. Really appreciate the shout out from Sheryl that the bike community is doing a good job of working with others. So really today, the state of mobility for all is that most people get around by cars, they get around by driving. US mobility policy really since the 1950s, probably before then, is focused on moving vehicles, moving them quickly, moving them over long distances, making sure that they don't get slowed down too much by congestion. And so the outcomes of that policy is that most people drive. We have auto dependence in many communities. We have very high rates of traffic fatalities. We have high rates of chronic diseases due to physical inactivity. And we have lower mobility for people with lower incomes and with disabilities. So the state of mobility for all is not good. To change that landscape, we're going to need to change investments. We know from this National Household Travel Survey data that almost 50% of vehicle trips are 3 miles or less, and those are great trips that can be moved to biking, to walking, to using a scooter, to using a low-speed light electric vehicle. You know, there's a lot of opportunity to capture those short trips that are currently accomplished by, you know, 2,000 to 6,000 pound cars and trucks. So that's a place that we need to put a lot more research and policy emphasis into doing. And when you look at federal investments, I think Sheryl did a great job of saying that there are diverse state and local approaches, but to make it easy, I'm going to talk about federal investments. We only spend 20% on transit. Only 5% of our federal roadway funding is for safety. About 2% is for biking and walking. So it's very easy to understand why we get the outcome of most people driving when our investments are mostly about driving, and safety and biking and walking and transit are these lower investment amounts. Looking at the American Jobs Plan, there's some really great stuff in there. I really hope that it passes and that we see this investment into our infrastructure. That investment includes investments in research for all the researchers who are here today. And I think it's important to say that it shows a change in investment with about twice the percentage level of investment for transit compared to normal federal policy, about 3 times the investment in safety for Vision Zero, and about 2 times the level of investment for biking and walking compared to normal federal transportation bills. One thing I want to highlight is that $174 billion for electric vehicles. That's really important because it will hopefully create a more sustainable transportation system, but that's also a lot of vehicles that we will buy in the coming years. And so when we're talking about automated vehicles or driver assistance systems, we're going to spend $174 billion in tax credits and other forms of incentives on electric vehicles. And those vehicles can be safer for people biking and walking or not safer for people biking and walking. So we really need to take action now to make sure that we have improvements in the new car assessment program and other federal tools to make sure that when Americans are spending that over $100 billion on electric vehicles, those vehicles are safer for everyone, and they improve everyone's mobility by making everyone safer. When you look at the US in terms of testing vehicles, we have not kept up with the rest of the world in terms of creating tests for vulnerable road user safety or for vehicle driver and occupant safety. The European New Car Assessment Program has adopted many more tests than the United States, even though the United States created the New Car Assessment Program framework. And when we look forward to automated vehicles, we don't have that baseline of testing for driver assistance systems that other countries have developed. So right now we are kind of dead in the water and really need to take action to get on top of our vehicle safety policy. The League of American Bicyclists has joined with others to promote AV tenants. But right now, when you look at federal policy, there's been 4 voluntary policy documents from USDOT, but there are 0 automated vehicle regulations. There's 0 driver assistance testing in the new car assessment program. And we have just 1 USDOT approved automated vehicle on the road, which is Neuro, which is a smaller delivery vehicle. And so I'm a huge believer that we need to do more for vehicle safety testing. We need to lean into vehicles being a big part of our safety solution. And in the United States, that's really important because unless something changes, more than 300,000 people are going to die on our roadways in the next decade. We've been mostly flat for the last over 2 decades in terms of traffic fatalities in the United States. If you are someone who believes in 0 traffic deaths, reaching Vision Zero, it's pretty clear that we are not headed there right now in the United States. Since 2009, bicyclist fatalities are up more than 30%, pedestrian fatalities are up more than 50%. And so we really need to take bold, decisive actions to change that. And we need research that points to things that are going to lead to long-term change. So one of the reasons I think we haven't seen a long-term change in our traffic safety trajectory is because we are stuck in an old approach to traffic safety that really conceives of it as an individual issue driven by individual behaviors of road users. Rather than thinking about how can we as a public policy community, as a government, as a variety of research institutions, really think of safety from an institutional perspective and create investments and programs that lead to safety. Right now, we really rely on traffic law enforcement, and we see a lot of problems with that. In the recent death of Dante Wright is a recent and tragic example. And so we are over relying on one solution and leaving solutions like better vehicle safety testing off the table. So we need to change how we approach vehicle safety, and really, as agencies, as policymakers, take responsibility for doing more to put drivers in good positions, put people biking and walking into safer places. And the Road to Zero Coalition came out with this great graphic that shows how we can save 31,000 lives per year using some of those technologies like driver assistance and alcohol detection. So these are things that we can do. They exist. They might take more research to get everywhere, but it's just a matter of will. And it'll help us not rely so much on traffic law enforcement if we can lean into these other modes of creating traffic safety. One of those ways to change traffic safety is mode shift. That takes a lot of time. When you look at Portland, Oregon, the largest city with the best mode share in the United States, you know, they had a state law requiring investment in bicycling in 1971, first local bike plan in 1973. New York City has had a 93% increase in the number of people biking to work, but it still only has 1.2% of people biking to work. So we need to make changes quicker. Historically, I think our investments have been driven by congestion for drivers. And as we move forward, we need to think more about safety and access. And that'll really do a lot of great by unlocking the potential of people who are currently underserved by our transportation system, and also increasing public health through fewer traffic deaths and more physical activity. You know, something like COVID, where we find all these comorbidities because people are not physically active and they have chronic diseases. The transportation system can totally address that if we choose to make that a priority for our investments. And so I think there are a lot of great new mobility opportunities. We've seen pop-ups and COVID responses changing our infrastructure in ways that people did not expect over the last year. I think we need to lean into how we can support that with federal funding so that we can show that change on streets and make people believe that traffic safety includes changing our streets. And we really need to embrace that there is more than just highways and defeating congestion as national issues that are worthy of transportation investment. So I love the idea of making the ADA something we really believe in as a country, getting sidewalk networks that are complete, and actually giving people the funding that they need to do that, as well as addressing climate change, racial justice, traffic safety, and competing for the future as we're looking towards automated vehicles and other things. So just want to highlight a few opportunities for change. There is an act called the E-Bike Act, which would give up to $1,500 for subsidies for the purchase of electric bikes. This is great. We've had subsidies for electric vehicles for a long time, but we haven't had subsidies for electric bikes. And it's exciting to maybe get that. I hope Congress takes that action. We also see a reintroduction of the bike commuter benefit, which would help more people purchase bikes. And there's a lot we can do with vehicle regulation, ADA, environmental review, which cares about the vehicle miles traveled generated by developments, and more investment in transportation demand management. I know there's a bill out there in Congress that would define it for the first time at the federal level and provide funding. So we really have the opportunity to embrace a future with more people biking, walking, taking transit, or kind of continue on the track we have of larger and larger cars and trucks being somewhat more efficient, but not that much more efficient because they're also growing in horsepower and weight. You know, we need to take decisive steps to get on a better trajectory. And one last thing that I want to mention is something that we can change right now, which is the manual on traffic control devices. This is kind of the building blocks of our roadways, and it's open for comment until May 14th. So some of these changes are really kind of simple. The two images at the top here, the 2009 image doesn't have green paint to show that there's a conflict zone for that vehicle that's turning right across the bike lane. The proposed figure this year does have that conflict paint, so that's great. But those small changes haven't really done what the advocacy community wants to do. Many bicycle and pedestrian and transit-oriented organizations are asking for this manual to be reframed for safety rather than getting more vehicles moving quickly on our roadways, and rewritten for the future rather than a document that's only updated every decade or so, and often is kind of catching up to good practices that we're seeing in cities for people biking and walking. So there are some very positive things in this proposed version. There's a lot more separated bike lanes. There's good illustrations such as this separated bike lane next to a parking spot for a person with disabilities. That's stuff that has never existed in this document before, and that's great. But overall, we're looking for it to be a document that's about safety, when really it hasn't changed from 1935 when it was first adopted, with the priority to move vehicles quickly. So that's an important place to weigh in, and I would appreciate people who have the opportunity and ability to weigh in on that. I'd also like people to think about Chapter 5 of that document, which for the first time addresses automated vehicles and has kind of been widely panned. A lot of people don't understand where that text came from, why they're saying certain things that they're saying. There's very little research cited for many of the things that are proposed in Chapter 5 about automated vehicles. And so when we're thinking about a future of how our roadways look and feel and how they make us safer, it's important to have something about how automated vehicles will change our traffic markings. But I and most people I've talked to just see what has been proposed as not meeting the challenge, not meeting the need. And whether or not it gets adopted into regulation this year by Secretary Buttigieg and the Biden administration, if you're a researcher, I think it'd be great to get into that space of how automated vehicles will interact with our traffic markings and our street designs and how that'll make things safer or not. So with that, I'll hand it off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was great information and so important for all of us to be able to think about so many of those things that deal with the active transportation and bicycling in particular. I want to take this time to introduce Thomas Weakley. He's the Director of Operations of the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association Foundation. He has been in some form of trucking for over 40 years, including as a driver, fleet owner, and manager of hazardous material transportation, distribution, and storage facility for 6 states. He also maintains a commercial driver's license with tanker and hazardous material endorsements. We couldn't find a better person to talk to us about that aspect of infrastructure in terms of mobility. So welcome. Thank you, Ken, for thank you, Thomas, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Anyway, I want to thank Carnegie Mellon University and the University Transportation Centers for inviting me to Mobility 21 as a representative of Owner-Operators Independent Drivers Association. That is ELIDA, not ONIDA. We don't make glassware. But so let me just briefly introduce who we are and why we feel like we need to be invited to any discussion of infrastructure and mobility needs, because that's what we do. ELIDA's membership has 155,000 members, driving some 220,000 trucks within the 48 contiguous states and Canada. Membership is predominantly owner-operators, those that are operating under their own authority and those that are leased on to carriers. We also have some 25,000 company driver members. We pretty much dominate the flatbed and reefer market, especially on the long haul market. So it's kind of a niche market for us. We operate primarily, most of our members operate on the spot market. So we're the ones that probably you see out in more rural areas, and pretty much rural areas are dependent upon owner-operators for their living, basically, and survival. Our members and the small fleets in the United States actually equal to the number of trucks and operate the number of trucks that the large carriers operate in the for-hire industry. What we are concerned with is not so much what you all have been talking about way down the road and all the different multi-year plans that you have. We predominantly operate on what's going on today. Here at ELIDA, we are looking very strongly at the new administration's financial numbers, which are astronomical as far as we're concerned, and really confusing to some extent. And it's especially confusing to us in that they are changing the traditional definition of infrastructure. I'm old and involved in trucking for over actually 5 decades, much of which was spent driving a truck or running a small fleet of trucks. My view of trucking and the infrastructure proposal is not at the 30,000 foot, the 20,000 foot, not even 100 feet up. My perspective comes from about 8 or 10 feet up, sitting in the driver's seat of an 18-wheeler above the pavement. Trucking and infrastructure looks and feels a whole lot different from that height. I've dodged the huge potholes in the roadways, and I've whispered many a prayer while driving 80,000 pounds across bridges that look like they're being held together by rust. So I look at the opportunities that are being put forth with the new realization, or the same realization, that no one is really talking or listening to the men and women that actually deliver the freight, vaccines, PPEs, respirators, and essential supplies that everyone needs. This past pandemic year has cost many small business truckies their business. While being told that drivers are essential to the recovery and fight against the spread of the pandemic and shortages, many state DOTs, in their infinite wisdom, closed down rest areas, parking facilities, and imposed restrictions on restaurants and truck stops, so the truckers on the front lines of the fight delivering essential PPEs and vaccine had no place to park, rest, eat, shower, or be checked for COVID-19. The promise of modernizing, in this new plan, 20,000 miles of roadways sounds good, until you realize that California and Texas alone, according to the administration's job report, has over 33,000 miles of roadway that needs modernizing. My definition of infrastructure is still roads and bridges, the same infrastructure that was given a D+ grade by the American Society of Civil Engineers and the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, found that more than 1/3 of U.S. bridges need major repair work or should be replaced. Truckers have repeatedly raised concerns about the lack of safe, lighted parking while on the road, yet there's nothing in the infrastructure plan that mentions parking. I know that what I'm saying here is not popular, but the truth is most of these programs will have to vie for the dollars that will be available, and I'm sure that for many social programs that are being considered, it appears as a unique opportunity to get funding for programs that get overlooked or pushed aside. We believe that traditional infrastructure funding has gotten the short end of the stick for many years, and the added attention of these programs will make it even more so. Realistically, there of course is hope and opportunity, but unless the administration tries to do an end around on the various committees, the final infrastructure program will look a lot different than the present proposal. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers 2020 report card, the U.S. has been underfunding its roadway maintenance for years, resulting in a $786 billion backlog of road and bridge capital needs. Of that, $435 billion is needed for just repair existing roads, $125 billion for bridge repair, $120 billion for targeted system enhancements. What is being set aside for roads and bridges in the new proposal is $115 billion. For the revamping of highways, roads, including bridges, doesn't sound like it's going to fulfill the promise to bring back better. Most of this funding will have to go through the various House and Senate committees for markups and review. Actual funding will still be predicated on the various committees in Congress that determine where and if the funding is part of the program. Since there are so many separate parts to the proposal, several committees will have to either waive their intention to review and mark up or work with the other communities to arrive at some kind of consensus. We have some astronomical numbers and goals, but little or no specifics. ELIDA has a government affairs team in D.C. that works closely with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And what they tell us that the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure is not being given any specifics. Do not think that I am opposed or that ELIDA is opposed to the new administration proposals to promote and encourage most of these programs, such as child care, etc., as they have great merit. But we have difficulty seeing some of them as infrastructure, and as infrastructure the proper funding mechanism. Now, lest you think I'm a partisan hack, I assure you, I do not want the next 4 years to be like the last 4 years, where a couple of drivers and some trucking executives are invited to the White House so the president can have a photo op and blow the horn of an 18-wheeler, and that becomes the high point of the administration's efforts for the drivers. According to the new president's job plan, due to decades of declining public investment, our roads, bridges, rail, and transit systems are in poor condition with $1 trillion backlog of needed repairs. The American Society of Engineers note that there's over 400 million miles of public roadway with 3.2 trillion miles of vehicle miles traveled in 2019. That has left 43% of our public roadways, or 172 million miles, in poor or mediocre condition with a promise to repair 20,000 miles. They estimate that these deteriorating roads are forcing the nation's motorists to spend nearly $130 billion each year in extra vehicle repair costs. They note that rural and urban roads are the most affected. In fact, the overall fatality rate in rural areas continues to be disproportionately higher than the fatality rate on all other roadways, and it is estimated that roadway design features are likely contributing factors in 1/3 of traffic fatalities. Rural America is almost totally dependent upon trucking for their existence. This is one of the primary niche markets that the owner-operators and small fleets that ELIDA represents service. There are far fewer fatality crashes on the interstates than on rural or urban roadways. Interstates, even with their potholes and higher speed limits and congestion, are the safest roadways in America. Our nation's highways and roads move 72% of all freight and nearly $17 trillion of the nation's goods. 47% of the nation's urban interstates are experiencing congestion during peak hours. But I want to end somewhat on a positive note, believe it or not. Job creation that involves construction and repairs and maintenance will provide tremendous opportunities for our members, especially those that involve the needs for flatbeds and reefers, which is the predominant truck that our members drive and pull, the trailers that they pull. It may exacerbate, however, the need for drivers, as many present drivers will turn to operating construction equipment or driving dumps with the same pay or better and home every night. So there is some positive things we see out of what's coming down the road, but that's where we look. We don't have the luxury of looking to 30 years down the road or 10 years down the road. We have to deal with what's going on right now. As Ken pointed out, the only thing that didn't show a big jump in that new plan was the maintenance of highways and the byways and the roadways in America. We think there needs to be a refocus on those things, and we certainly will push for that. And we think the idea of infrastructure as it's being proposed is way too broad. And I'll be real honest with you, for those of you who are looking for getting those things in an infrastructure bill, infrastructure has not been very productive or good for the industry so far. I'm not sure I want to put it in that particular type of proposal. With that, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. We appreciate your ending on a positive note, though, and we all know that there are lots of things that can be improved in the funding for all ends of the spectrum for mobility. I want to take this time to quickly thank Sheryl and Ken and Thomas for their comments. They have really captured some important key concepts related to improving mobility for all of us. I'm going to turn it over now to Lisa Kay so that she can direct us for our afternoon and let us know about the discussion groups to follow.
Thanks so much, Carol, and all the panelists. Raj, I think is going to take us into our break.
Thank you, Carol, for that nice panel, moderating that nice panel. Very passionate arguments for helping out transit, the disabled, bicyclists, of course, and then for the trucking industry, a very coherent set of arguments, if you will. So going forward, all your inputs to the policy process would be very helpful at the US DOT and beyond.